would go on that side. It's probably for the best. Yeah, and then kind of rearrange it, adjust it for where you are.
With the band.
All right, and then you can kind of tip it back towards you when you're ready. All right, are you all settled where you want to be? And kind of. There you are. Just test it out.
You want me to
Hello?
check?
Yep.
How's that
That's good.
Hello, hello, hello.
Sounds good.
Native
Does sound good.
makers on tour.
All right. Well, it looks like we're ready to get started then. So I just wanted to welcome you all and thank you all for coming out. And I was curious, how many of you are new to the Hill Center? New people? Very nice, very nice. So we have those lovely programs on your chairs if you want to take a look at the other things that Hill Center has to offer. But I won't go into it now so we can get straight into it. So just some reminders. Please silence your cell phones.
No heckling. No, yeah.
That's the first one. That's the first one. Because yeah, we don't want to hear any other sound besides these two gentlemen up here. So silencing your cell phones. And East City Books is joining us tonight. So they are selling books over here, and there will also be a signing afterwards. So I would recommend purchasing Confirmation Bias. And so I'll just pass it along then, and we'll go straight into Paul Kane, who's of the Washington Post, and he'll be moderating a discussion with Carl Hulse of the New York Times. So a round of applause.
So, thank you. I want to say something before I turn it over to Paul. For one thing, both my wife and I used to live right across the street from this place back in the 80s. So we love what you've done with the place. It's always great to come here. Trust me, it was a totally different facility. I just want to thank Paul for agreeing to do this. And, you know, we're both Hill residents, and Paul really, really understands Congress and especially the Senate. And he did that because he worked for a thing called States News, which probably a few of you are familiar with back in the day, but also Roll Call. So Paul really, really learned this stuff. And I also think it's just great that we, as representatives of the media industrial complex, we can actually come here and do this together. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, Paul. So
You're welcome.
You have to
Carl.
do all the work.
Yeah. When you cover Congress and you cover the Senate in particular, as a lot of this book is about, you spend a lot of time standing in hallways. Vince is nodding because he's done it. And you really get to, it's a weird thing, but you really get to know who your comrades, your colleagues, and Carl is obviously one of the best. And I appreciate that he still called me a Hill resident.
It's a point of dispute, actually.
After more than 20 years of living very much on Capitol Hill, a year ago I moved south of the bridge down to Navy Yard, and Carl was very upset. He does not think I really count anymore, but I do have a 20003 zip code, so I feel like that gives me some
speaking about standing around the halls, Russell Baker had probably the greatest line when he was covering Congress. He said that he spends his time standing outside closed doors on marble hallways waiting for men to come out and lie to him. And that's kind of an apt description of our job up there.
All right, so this book, Confirmation Bias, it's great. It is the culmination of, you could go back to the 1980s, you could go back to 1969. In a lot of ways, it's the last sort of 16, 17 years of these judicial wars. And it was really, really myopic stuff. I was at Roll Call, part of my beat was the Senate leadership, and I was covering all these inside fights about circuit court nominees that nobody could understand. Like, there were only about 4 reporters who really covered all of it. And then the last 3 years happened. And one day, a year ago, Carl said, "Here's my book." And I was so happy for him. And then I also let out a few expletives because I thought, that's going to be a damn good book.
And he also was like, here, that was my book.
So like any good book, you sort of find ways to start in the middle of the story and weave your way back. The one thing first question I want to ask is right smack in the middle, page, is this 153? Carl, this line sets up, I think, the elevator pitch for this book. McConnell not only procured a Supreme Court seat, he elected Donald Trump president.
Which is really the reason that.
Explain that.
Yeah.
Explain that without.
Yeah, no, that's
without
actually the
reciting the
reason
entire
that I
book.
wrote the book. I mean, it's true that judicial nomination fights, they're really for the Senate nerds, but they're super important and have a big impact because, these people are lifetime appointees and are going to be around for quite a while. But to me, the hook for this book was that Mitch McConnell, when he decided on February 13th, 2016, while he was down in the Caribbean vacationing. And we all chuckle at that because the idea of Mitch on the beach is just so bizarre. But I think Secretary Chow is the beach person. So I said, this changed U.S. history, actually changed world history. This was a world history changing decision that he made sort of spur of the moment. And the reason that it was world changing, he didn't know it at the time, obviously. He did not know it. He was doing it to protect himself and to show the right that he was serious. And he hated Obama, so he didn't want to give Obama another justice. But what he did was, totally unexpectedly, he gave Republicans a reason to vote for Donald Trump. A lot of Republicans who didn't like Donald Trump. And the list, and we can talk about how the list came to be and what that was about, but the list and Trump's, the fact that Trump was going to get to fill this seat if McConnell could hold Republicans in line, keep it open, helped draw the evangelicals, helped him survive, access Hollywood, and Trump got it. This is one of the things he gets a little bit because his sister was a federal judge. Right. And so he sort of understands a little bit about the federal judiciary, but not totally, because he also talked about the bills his sister signed as a judge. That's in the book. But anyway, Trump got this. So the night that Hillary Clinton is being accepting the nomination in Philadelphia, Paul's hometown, big sports fan there, Donald Trump was speaking somewhere in Iowa. I forget whether it was Cedar Rapids or some other rapids there. I'd say that as an Illinoisan to criticize Iowa. But he's up there, and it's the usual Trump crowd and chanting, and women for Trump are starting to come out at this point. And he says, if you love me, vote for Donald Trump, that's great. But if you hate me, you still have to vote for Donald Trump. Judges, judges, judges. Republicans vote on judges much more than Democrats. It really worked. And then at the end of that riff, he goes, if you elect Hillary Clinton, she'll appoint judges and will wind up being Venezuela. So I don't know I don't know where that kind of came from. Mitch didn't mean to do it, but he did it. And it was funny, in the book, right around that point that you referenced, he's over at the National Republican Senatorial Committee. We're watching the election that night. You've got to remember, all the Republicans expected to lose. They expected to lose the Senate, certainly expected Trump to lose. And McConnell is over there, and as the returns start coming in, even he's surprised, and he turns to someone who's not identified in the book, and says, are we going to make America great again tonight? And that was it. And he elected Donald Trump.
Yeah.
By accident, some ways.
All right, so we're going to go back and forth. I've got some questions that will sort of move through the chronology of the book, and we'll have plenty of time for questions a little bit later, probably about 45 minutes of questions. We'll have some people walking around with mics, and we'll point you out when it's time for that. But let's really kind of go deep into the vacations, because these two vacations that happen on President's Day weekend 2016 are this crazy monumental thing that impact the course of history. So where was Antonin Scalia? If he were here in Washington, D.C., at home with his family, he might still be alive.
Yeah. Actually, that's actually true. So he was down in West Texas. What's the name of the town? I actually forget. It's outside this town that's actually appeared.
I'm sorry. Which page, which volume of the report is that on? That's too soon.
That is a Washington joke. There,
I'm glad everyone got it.
So it's this town. I honestly, the name is escaping me, but it's in film a lot because it looks like an old Texas town. But way outside this town, there is this weird sort of hunting resort. It's a big luxury place. And there's a meeting there that weekend of this also kind of odd Catholic hunting group that Scalia was taking part of it. It's like the Order of St. Hubertus, because he's like a patron saint of hunters, and they wear robes and stuff. You know, it's like, well, he's used to wearing a robe, I guess. So he's down there. He likes to hunt and fish, and he's down at this rather bizarre place. But it's super nice and it's huge. It has its own big landing strip where they can fly people in. He gets there Friday night with a friend of his from DC. You know, Supreme Court justices, are there any here tonight? They're really not bound by any kind of ethics laws, and they do.
Did anyone invite Merrick Garland?
Yeah, we can talk about him. That they get a lot of free travel and they go on all these trips, and it's kind of an interesting. Some of them actually make money that way. This wasn't that. So he's down there. Eats a big dinner Friday night, and you know he's in the El Presidente suite because he's the most distinguished person there, part of this group that weekend, and so he doesn't show up for breakfast, and the owner is a little worried, but he says the justice told him the night before he was a little tired and not feeling well, and he doesn't show up, so they go up, knock on the door, no answer, and they walk in, and he's died in his sleep. And very peaceful. The only thing that was sort of weird was there's a little pillow, and he'd obviously been having trouble breathing, and the pillow kind of slipped over him. A lot of conspiracy theories about this, but the U.S. government they have dismissed all that. I've talked to people at the highest levels of the government about this, saying, because I still get, was Scalia murdered, or was he with a woman who's not his wife? Not that either. And no, he was not healthy. He, was a big eater, smoker, big cigars. So he dies, and the word starts to slip back, and Washington freaks out. And one of the book, part of the book, it's a chapter. It's like business to attend to. One of these Scalia family members, he has like 9 kids or something, right?
Yes.
And
I'm grew up the youngest of 9, so that's a factoid that I generally remember.
One of them calls Leonard Leo, who of course is the head of the Federalist Society and the big conservative judicial thing, and gives him a heads up that this is happening. So he says, Father would understand you have business to attend to. Yeah. So the politics of this, boom, kicked in.
How many hours after
this is
death?
Probably just a few hours. Actually, not all of the Scalia family members had been notified.
Leonard Leo, head of the Federalist Society, found out before some of the Scalia children?
Yes. So, and here, this is, we play this little pantomime in Washington when people die who are big political figures and when there's going to be a lot of politics around them. So we always kind of pretend that, like, for the first day, you're going to talk about the person and remember them, and everybody says, well, we'll hold the politics off for later, it's a solemn moment, and this is constant. And this one, boom, no, it was so big, everybody kicked into gear immediately. It's like, Justice, you were great, we're moving on, and we're moving on really fast here. There's a lot going on. So that was one vacation. So McConnell.
Now, President's Day is one of the, as some of our Old Hill veterans know, it's always a week-long 10-day recess.
Right.
So this is the start of a 10-day recess. So all of the 100 senators are spread to the winds. And
it had huge impact, the whole vacation thing.
Beach Boy.
He's down there, and he says, Mitch McConnell was the first person I interviewed for this book because I knew I had to have his story from that day. So I talked to everybody about what were they doing that day. So he's sitting there, and he's contemplating all this, and he is also in touch with all his aides, including Josh Holmes, who's somebody Paul and I know very well, chief of staff, super smart political guy. You might not like his politics, but man, he's really good at it. And so McConnell's sitting there, and he decides immediately, as I say in the book, he's like, I knew if the shoe was on the other foot, they would do the same thing. And they is the Democrats, right? He's convinced himself immediately that if this was the situation were reversed, Democrats would do the same thing and block it, because they've made comments like this in the past, both Schumer, notably Joe Biden. So that's his rationale there. I've argued about this with Senator McConnell, because I keep saying, and there's a lot of Democrats in this room and some former staff people, I go, the Democrats, they would cave on that, because that's what they do. But so anyway, so he decides he wants to stop this. Josh Holmes is on the phone with him and says, all right, if you really are serious about doing this, you need to do it right now, because later that night there is a Republican presidential primary debate, which really figures into all this too. There's a lot going on this day. Obama is actually out in Rancho Mirage, California, on a golf vacation. So I'm sure Trump was paying attention to that. So Josh Holmes says, if you're going to do this, what you don't want to have happen is Ted Cruz to be in that debate that night, because he was Trump's chief rival at the time. You don't want Ted Cruz to be the guy to say, we're going to block this, because if Ted Cruz is the guy who does this, the other Republicans aren't going to want to do it, right? So you have to get out there to beat Ted Cruz. And that's why right before 6 o'clock, I was home. I actually had been at band practice earlier. I'm in a band, Paul knows about it, and some other people here do too. And I had my phone turned off. I turned on my phone, and it had blown up. I mean, Supreme Court justice does. And so about 6 o'clock, this thing comes, and it just floored everyone. It floored us all. I'm sure you had the same reaction. Mitch McConnell sends out this thing. Justice Scalia, who he knew and admired, was very close to, and just really adored the guy in some ways, and just saw him as this giant of jurisprudence. So McConnell says, hey, great, Scalia, we've got to honor his memory. Oh, by the way, I am not going to let this president fill that seat. Let the people will decide. And this was this was created by Senator McConnell.
Had this been a democratic appointed justice, we'll never know, and we don't want to wish.
Yeah,
I'm not trying to wish anything ill on.
Yeah, that's
any
actually
of those
an interesting
four.
Thought.
Scalia
had special.
This wasn't. The Scalia was special because of his conservative intellectual firepower, but also this would have tipped it to 5.
You're replacing Antonin Scalia with a Democrat appointee, and a Democrat appointee by a president that McConnell really just did not like at all. He saw Obama as like a threat to the country. He did not want Obama to get a third justice. So, I mean, and you think about it, all this played out that day and then the months after, but it had such huge impact. Now there's a third part of this that night too. Well, Obama's out in Rancho Mirage. They're trying to figure out what to do. They see McConnell's statement, they go nuts. Don McGahn, the White House counsel, who's also in a band, actually in a very good one. They actually make money at their band. And he's driving down to Ocean City, and I'm going to say this, Paul, because this is for you. So his wife, Shannon Flaherty, who we both know quite well, texts him, and he's driving down. He's got a car jammed full of band gear for the weekend gig in Ocean City, and it says Scalia died. That's what the text says. And so he pulls over into a Wawa parking lot on 50 and cries.
I love Wawa.
Yeah. And gets and also realizes there's a debate and gets on the phone with Trump. And he's like, Ted Cruz again. Ted Cruz. Watch out for Ted Cruz. He's going to try and politicize this, and he's going to seize this. He was a Supreme Court clerk. He's on judiciary. He knows a lot about this. So he's going to try and get ahead of this, which he actually did. And because he had been accusing saying Trump was going to appoint his sister, who was sort of pro-choice and had done some decisions, signed some bills, in Trump's words, that were pro-choice. And he had been running around telling people, if you elect Donald Trump, he's going to appoint his sister. So they were trying to get ahead of that. So Trump is on the phone with McGahn. McGahn's urging him to be cautious. And Trump goes, what if we throw out some names? What if we throw out some names? Here's who I would appoint to reassure these conservatives, right? So this is the beginning of the list. Trump kind of recognizes this. So McGahn goes, okay, Brett Kavanaugh. That's the first name he mentioned. The first name he mentioned.
When you read this book, he does an amazing job of weaving Brett Kavanaugh throughout. It is just amazing to get to. Let's talk about the the Obama administration effort, and both the decision to pick Merrick Garland and then the just overall
failure.
There's I marked up this page, a quote from one of the White House Democratic operatives just saying, after it was all done, it was pretty clear that the money wasn't going to be there. The grand plan to spend $36 million now looked like a pipe dream, and the effort eventually drew in less than $10 million. And we never heard his name once at the DNC.
No, there's so much going on.
Why did they pick Merrick Garland, and then why did they not fight for Merrick Garland?
A lot of reasons. But before I even say this, I thought Joe Biden the other day was saying, one, he said he would consider renominating Merrick Garland if he was elected president, which is kind of a crazy idea because I think Justice Garland, who's a fantastic person who was treated pretty badly, would be 68. So why you want to nominate 60-year-old justices, I don't know. But he also said, Vice President Biden said, the Democrats didn't do a good enough job on behalf of Merrick Garland. The Democrats. I'm like, dude, you were vice president.
If you were,
this was your job.
Yes.
So just a little mention on the vacation thing and the fact that Congress is out of town for this period had another huge impact. So Ron Klain, who I'm sure people here know and was he's done a lot of these Supreme Court things. He was also in charge of Gore's recount, but played by Kevin Spacey in the great Recount movie, if you've never seen it. But so Ron Klain, Wednesday, the president comes back. So this is Wednesday. Congress is still out. And they go to the White House, and they're going to go through everything they always go through to pick a Supreme Court justice. And they have this meeting, and they start all the paperwork. And, they've done this already twice, very well, too, by the way. And so they go through this meeting, and Ron Klain pulls Dennis McDonough aside at the end and says, Dennis, we all know that Obama's going to nominate Merrick Garland. He should do it tomorrow. Don't wait. Don't go through this process. You're going to use up a month, and McConnell's message is going to be hardened. That was one of the few things I heard where I was like, that could have been maybe a game changer. It would have been different. Merrick Garland, so to your actual question, Merrick Garland was held in reserve by President Obama and the White House for exactly this situation.
He had been considered when they picked both Sotomayor and Kagan.
Right. And he was runner-up to Kagan, and Obama really liked him and said at the time, let's hold Merrick Garland in reserve in case I ever have to go up against a Republican Senate, because they will confirm Merrick Garland. And the reason they'll confirm Merrick Garland in Obama's mind and the mind of the White House was that because Orrin Hatch had said nice things about him. And the reason he'd said nice things about him is they liked Merrick Garland a lot more than Elena Kagan.
Yeah.
So that looked like a good trade. No trade anymore. So they thought that Garland was a guy who could get through. And so they set out to get him. But what they found out was the money wasn't there. People didn't want to do it. And there's a whole other subtext to this. Everyone just assumed Hillary Clinton was going to win. So you're either going to get Garland or you're going to get even a more liberal, younger justice. So the motivation was very mixed, and they just never really got it going.
Describe the scene of the day that they announced Garland as the nominee in the Senate Democratic leadership
Yeah.
suites.
So
because there was this push and pull of
whether
do
to
we
have
want to nominate a really, not necessarily liberal firebrand, but inspire liberal voters, minority voters, and then versus Merrick Garland. What was that scene like?
So this was the tension all the way. There were a lot of people in the Democratic Party who wanted Obama to go with a younger person and maybe a minority or a woman or maybe a woman minority, maybe ultimately. Because if you're going to lose the fight and not fill the seat, it's better to have this emblematic person that can really motivate the base and maybe bring out minority voters. But they wanted to go with Garland. And so the day they start out with, Paul and I both had heard this story, they start out by doing a conference calls to alert everyone about this. And one person in Dick Durbin's office, Senator Durbin lives close by here, I think these days, said that when they said officially it was Garland, the staff in the room went, oh, that was the reaction. They did not want Garland, but that was the choice they made. And I mean, and Nan Aaron, who I'm sure also some of you know, has been in judicial politics since the 80s, really one of the first liberal advocates to jump into this. She actually said she thought Garland was a pretty good idea, that ultimately he had somebody that you could sell. He's super respected in Washington. I mean, he is revered both as a nice guy. The chapter on him in the book is called Dumbledore, because he's a super Harry Potter fan. One of his daughters had reading issues, and they really improved her reading by reading the book to her and her books to her and her reading the books back. And so he's always quoting like Dumbledore and Hermione Granger. And at the White House, they started calling him Dumbledore, kind of behind the scenes. Just an exceptional person and a really nice guy. He has never talked about this. He went back to the White House after this didn't happen, and in the book, and they had this big celebration, afterwards. Not celebration, but he thanked everyone for all the work, and he also said, "Thank you for not getting my reputation ruined as part of this." It was going to be hard to ruin anyway. He's really not much there. He is such a nice guy that he called me twice to discuss why he wouldn't talk to me.
Why the second time?
Because we hadn't hit the first time. He calls and says, I'll tell you, he calls, leaves this long message, thanks for the note. I really sent him this really great note because he's from Illinois, and I knew how to pull the strings. And he goes, man, this is on the voicemail. That note was good, but I just won't talk about it. And I thought that was going to be that. He goes, but I really want to tell you in person, no, so I'll call you back. He's a nice guy.
My own point of personal privilege, I wrote something at the time about Republicans and conservatives who did like him, one of whom was then Judge Brett Kavanaugh, who sent me a note, and I had to have an off-the-record conversation with him standing outside Nats Park for one of the home openers.
Yeah, I remember when you told me that, actually.
Because he wanted to make sure that I wasn't saying he endorsed him, but he did very much want to say off the record that he's a really nice guy.
So two things that tells you about Brett Kavanaugh that we all know is, one, he's super political. Two, he liked to talk to reporters. He was a guy who talked a lot to reporters, and still does, actually. Not to me, but to others.
The list.
Yeah,
let's
huge thing.
So now we're sort of move into like the spring. Trump is really starting to gain steam. One by one, they're falling off. And he really, tell the story. How does he come up with the list?
He actually, from these names, they came up with the idea of putting together a list that they would then release to show who Trump would put on the court to kind of knock out these rumors that he was really going to put all these liberals on there. You have to remember, at the time, there were Republicans who were worried Trump was a Democrat. He had contributed to Democrats. He had, been a Democrat. So there was a lot of uncertainty about him.
He hosted Chuck Schumer at Mar-a-Lago not not
Yeah,
long
yeah.
ago for a fundraiser.
So this was really seen as a thing, but it's like, okay, so who do we put on this list? So Trump's coming to Washington for one of his first big coming out parties, and he's going to go down to the hotel, which is still under construction. So they have this meeting over at Jones Day, where Don McGahn is a partner, I think, probably at the time, wasn't he?
Yes, Don was still a partner there.
And so they call in a bunch of Republicans, because the Republicans on the Hill are very leery of Trump. I know that's hard to think about now, but they really were.
I was standing outside that day.
Yeah.
I remember it well.
And so they didn't get any of the big name leaders or anything, but it was Newt was there, and I think Bob Livingston, and lobbyists and things. So, but Leonard Leo got a call from McGahn before the meeting and McGahn says, hey, could you stick around a little bit afterwards? But Leo doesn't know Trump either at this point, and says, could you stick around? We have an idea we want to run by you. And then Leo goes, well, I want to get ready. So what is it? And McGahn's like, well, we have this idea about putting a list together. But at that point, they're like, we just want to have a list so he can refer to it and draw some names from it and everything. And so they get to this meeting, and Trump's really working Leo over and trying to ingratiate himself, and says, hey, what do you think about the idea of this list? And Leo says, well, that's never been done before. Why wouldn't we do that? And then Trump's like, yeah, and we'll make it public. And McGahn's sitting there, and he said that he almost fell out of his chair, because there was never any discussion of making this thing public. He's like, holy shit, nobody's ever done that. We're going to get locked in on these judges. So they start doing this list, and the idea of the list is to help Trump in the primaries. But he wins in Indiana, and it's kind of over. He puts out this foreign policy list too. This is on the foreign policy list are all the people who've been indicted and run out. The foreign policy list was a fiasco. It was like the end of the Trump administration. It was really bad.
Papadopoulos.
Yeah, everybody on there was like, this was the guy who used his model UN time as a student on his resume. So they've got this idea that they're going to do, and then so Trump's going to be the nominee, and the list kind of fades, and Trump calls McGahn and says, let's put the list out. And McGahn's like, what? This was for the primary. You want to put it out now? This could be a bad thing in the general election, because you're trying to show people you're not going to appoint a bunch of crazy people. But so they pardon my language here, but they go ahead, and Trump, because he's thinking about the foreign policy list and how bad that went, he goes, this better not get fucked up. That's on the phone call. So they put out the list. It's kind of a bunch of old standards, guys that have been around and are circuit court judges, and Trump, I'm going to do this, guarantee we'll pick from this list. Well, the first list, neither of the people he picked were on the first list, by the way. They were on later lists. So they had to get the people they wanted. They had to kind of maneuver the list, and they liked Gorsuch at the time too, but didn't put him on the first list because he wasn't a big name, and they didn't want people to start really looking at him. So there was the list is the list, but there was a lot of malleability to it. And Kavanaugh was ultimately put on after Trump was elected.
So talk more about Don. Don McGahn is the White House counsel position is something that is usually one of the lower profile posts in any administration. Sort of talk about, flash forward to the transition and how much influence Don really had in saying Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and all of these circuit judges. And is there any White House counsel who has wielded anything close to this power?
Not on the judges, just to answer that last question. So Don McGahn, as I say in the book, he's like a radical person. He's radical government philosophy. It's conservative, but libertarian too. It's like he's very different, and he doesn't like government regulation at all. But he and Mitch McConnell bonded because he was nominated by Bush to go and chair the Federal Election Commission, which of course Mitch McConnell wanted weakened to the greatest extent possible, which Don McGahn was only too happy to do. So he went over there and just really just shut the place down, basically. Don McGahn was sworn in in the chambers of a judge to the FEC, in the chambers of a judge on the DC Circuit Court. Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh. Don walks out of that swearing in and says to Shannon, his wife, like, that guy's going to be on the Supreme Court someday. So Don McGahn is a fascinating figure. So he gets in, and he and McConnell cook up this deal where they're just going to roll all these judges through. And the way that McGahn was going to do this was he told Trump, in taking the White House counsel job, that he wanted sole ownership of the judicial nominations. Usually very convoluted process that you probably know way more about than I.
There's usually somebody at DOJ,
committees,
the Senate Judiciary,
all this vetting that goes on. Don McGahn was picking these judges. So, and that really cut the time short. And they were also doing all this research on the writings of these judges, because Don is really interested in powerful opinions that are written, conservative opinions. And Don, these Republicans, they're into the social issues. But Don McGahn, Leonard Leo, and some of these guys, what they're really into is what they would call deconstructing the administrative state. They want to tear down the federal bureaucracy, really weaken the regulatory power of the federal government, which they think has become this government by bureaucracy because they're having too much say-so in interpreting federal statute. Gorsuch is like the king of deconstructing the administrative state in his opinions. Now, a lot of old-time Washington people here. Ann Gorsuch, right? That's his mother, head of the EPA, and, fell in a really bad scandal during the Reagan administration. People went to jail. She had to go back to Colorado. It was sort of a disgrace. Her life really got thrown off track. And in the book, I talk about how Neil Gorsuch, who went to Georgetown Day with a couple of years behind Brett Kavanaugh. And so in the book, he's in high school and this is really affecting him. And he says, Mom, you're not a quitter. Why are you quitting? She goes back. And so this is a big moment in a kid's life. So when Gorsuch was nominated, on the power of his writings about this, I was in the hearing room the day the confirmation beginning. Democrats really didn't lay a glove on Gorsuch, right? They were so distracted by Trump and the travel ban, and they really didn't get focused at all on Gorsuch. Agreed. So the White House guys are in the back of the room, the guys who are doing the real work. And I said, hey, I've got a theory on Gorsuch. They go, oh, what's that? I said, he's still angry about what happened to his mother, and he's come back to destroy Washington. And they go, that's our theory too. And they meant it. So Gorsuch, but at the beginning of the book, so Don is in there. Don knows exactly who he wants to put on the Supreme Court from the get-go, and he wants to put Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh on the court. And that was the plan from the day of the transition. It was always going to be those two guys if Don McGahn got his way, and he did.
Looking back up a little bit to, let's not go too deep into the weeds of the
blue slip,
blue slips and nuclear option, but one of the things that happens during Gorsuch is the Senate Republicans, as Mitch McConnell and Harry Reid in different times had said, broke the rules in order to change the rules. Explain how we got there to a point in which judges could be filibustered, held to a 60-vote threshold, to the point where Gorsuch won confirmation with, I think, 55, and Kavanaugh got 52.
At the court, yeah.
So,
well, the whole judicial nomination process, as you actually, I'm going to say this truthfully, as you know better than I, has just gotten ruined. And the book lays it out and also talks a lot about Miguel Estrada, who Democrats were filibustering back in the early days of the Bush administration. But famously, so it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. There was a temporary reprieve, but McConnell and the Republicans are really slow walking Obama judges. So Harry Reid in 2013 gets really mad and changes the rules. It says you can approve.
Explain the ruling that really.
So
Harry,
in the book, I
this
mentioned
is important.
This. Yeah. In
Harry
the book,
Reid
I mentioned this.
was trying to get the votes to go nuclear.
He's really, he's been unhappy. And the White House feels they're getting really screwed on the DC Court of Appeals because there's vacancies there, and the Republicans are not giving Obama any judges on that court. It's hugely important because, they rule on all these cases. And so, the Democrats are getting kind of worked up, and they're set in motion a plan. But in August, I think, of 2013, there's a ruling that comes down from the DC Circuit, like basically Yucca Mountain is this nuclear waste repository proposal in Nevada. Reed spent his whole career fighting it and defunding it. It's like his major thing back home.
It's less than 100 miles outside Las Vegas.
No. It always did sound a little wacky. I don't even get how this works. You're going to hide it sounds like it's something from The Simpsons. You're going to hire all the nuclear waste in a mountain next to Vegas. But so he thinks he's killed it, and there's a decision that comes out of the DC Circuit that revives it. Reed goes nuts. You know who wrote that? Brett Kavanaugh. And
who wrote the dissenting opinion?
Merrick Garland. It's all this is a pretty closed world here. And so Reed, now he's really angry. And one of the quotes in the book's like, Harry Reid finally learned the importance of the federal judiciary with that ruling. And so, so they changed the rules so you can put nominees through on a simple majority vote, except for the Supreme Court. But it really changes the Senate in terms of how these nominations are going to be handled, because there wasn't, the history was he didn't always require the 60 votes, and I'm talking about over the history. There weren't a lot of filibusters, but the threat was there. The threat was there. So you could, these federal judgeships, senators have used to really just consider them patronage jobs. It's kind of changed over the years. These were jobs they would hand out to their big donors and the big lawyers back home. So, and then it's evolved into this more important thing because we're so partisan and gridlocked that the courts are having to referee all these legislative fights. So Reed changes that. Republicans would take the Senate in 2014. So they pretty much just stopped doing judges. In fact, Trump's very disingenuous. He talks about, Obama left us all these judge vacancies. Why did he do that? It's like, dude, what happened here? It wasn't Obama. It was Ted Cruz, by the way.
Yeah.
And so Obama gets in. He gets to fill the Supreme Court vacancy. And the Democrats say, all right, you can still filibuster. We're going to filibuster Gorsuch. Well, the Republicans were thrilled. They're like, great, we're going to change the rules immediately. And we'd rather change the rules on Gorsuch, who's obviously a qualified judicial just nominee. I mean, he didn't really have anything, just super conservative. And he's not changing the balance of the court. He's a conservative replacing a conservative. So the Republicans are like, great, we're going to change the rules. In fact, in the book, I have a White House memo, the whole strategy that was written in January about how they were going to do it. And at the bottom, it says, and we'll change the rules. So they were never going to not change the rules. But the Republicans thought this was a huge mistake, because save that for the next one. If a Democratic nominated justice leaves and you're going to replace them, then you're changing the balance of the court. And people will be a little less willing to just jump on the rules change. And Republicans say now, to this day, and I've argued about this with Chuck Schumer. He thinks I'm full of it, and he thinks Michael Bennett's full of it. And people who said changing the filibuster at that point was stupid. But, Republicans now say we would have never been able to change the rules to confirm Kavanaugh. It's one thing to confirm him. It's another thing to really just contort the system to confirm him. And they think they would have had a tough time. It's all guesswork, and that's where we are. So the party gets in there, and the minority party can't do anything to really stop nominations at all.
Okay, let's try and open it up for questions. I've kind of intentionally not gone too deep into the most recent Supreme Court fight, because I'm guessing that might be a lot of the questions, but we've got two mics here. Let's just raise your hand. I mean, I can keep going. All right, we've got one down here in the front. He's already got a book, so you got to get the first question.
Can't wait to read it. Yeah, so I wonder, I think of the Kavanaugh fight, and I think of all of these like TV moments that really seem to captivate the country. And one of them is Lindsey Graham and the searing sort of defense he gave of Kavanaugh. And I think maybe some people viewed it as a turning point for Graham and this show, people would put it a show he put on for the president. Could you go into that and his decision to really be that champion of the right?
Yeah, well, Paul, you should talk about this too. Paul is the Lindsey Graham, John McCain analyst. But let me say a few things about that. This was the day when the special prosecutor was handling the Republican questions.
Yeah, that very quiet, polite woman who asked,
sitting at a little desk.
I mean, she asked questions in the tone that Bob Mueller answered them yesterday.
Yeah, no.
It was just,
Well, she was used to questioning sexual assault victims in court, where you're actually doing a much different thing, where you're trying to establish, very slowly and carefully the timeline of the incident. It wasn't working here. So Graham's the first guy that day, the first Republican to say, I'm going to talk. I'm not going to let you listen. I'm Lindsey Graham. I'm going to be the next chairman of the judiciary. But it was planned. McGahn and Graham had discussed what he was going to do, and what Graham was trying.
During the break between, because
it was
Dr.
even
Blasey,
before that. It was even before that, I think.
While Dr. Blasey Ford was testifying.
No, yeah, I think
she testifies. Everybody thinks the entire nomination is just tanked.
Right.
There's a long break, an hour and a half, and he comes back.
And
Kavanaugh.
What they wanted to do is forget about the Democrats, because this is majority rules now. They wanted to make sure that the Republicans weren't going to break. So he wanted to turn it on the Republicans and say, if you go along with the Democrats on this, you are, defiling this fine man. So his speech was intended to actually galvanize the Republicans, and it worked. I mean, they really turned it around. But another thing about that, so in the book, Kavanaugh says he doesn't watch it. I have no idea. People tell me he did not watch her testimony, but like Trump always says he doesn't watch stuff, but then he tweets about what he's watching. But I don't know if Kavanaugh watched it or not. So he gets there. They're actually in Tom Tillis's office, and Tillis is on the committee, and they're in like a conference room, and Kavanaugh comes in with his wife and says, "What do I need to know?" And McGahn says, "You got to reboot the room. You need to go out. This is what you've spent your whole life fighting for." There was a guy, these nominees are all surrounded by their old clerks. This is their support network. I mean, they've got dozens and dozens of these people. And one of the clerks are in this room, and the clerk, his old clerk, says, maybe you should go out there and be conciliatory. And McGahn blows up. Like, did I tell you you could say that? Everybody out of this room. And the funny, actually, and Kavanaugh's wife starts walking out too. He goes, "No, you can stay. You're supposed to be here." So he says, you got to go out there and get tough. And they had actually practiced at the White House of him being more aggressive in his responses, which is why you get like the Amy Klobuchar thing. So a lot of this wasn't spontaneous, but Graham. Well, why don't you talk about Graham and John McCain and what we've seen?
So Graham and McCain, Lindsey became this sort of sidekick to John McCain. By the way, 2 years ago today was when John McCain came back from having been diagnosed with brain cancer, delivers this emotional appeal for the Senate to come together, and then voted for the procedural move to move ahead with the repeal of healthcare debate. Liberals went crazy. And then 2.5 days later, sort of 1 a.m., we get the thumbs down. But Graham was always the sort of sidekick to McCain, and McCain was the guy who was always trying to bring people together, these gangs. And the first gang that Lindsey Graham was ever a part of was in 2005, where John McCain was trying to prevent Republicans from going nuclear to pass Bush judges. And so Lindsey Graham had just sort of always been part of this mix around judicial nominations, and on immigration and other issues, But in the last 2 years, I mean, at one point in 2016, he was crying on stage at a journalism dinner about how much the country was going to hell because Republicans were going to nominate Trump. But over the last 2 years, you've just seen this drift. And
Or he's now Trump's best friend in the Senate. Really.
Probably. And that moment was the the final act in sort of it is. So that's probably about September 30th or so. Yeah. McCain had died 1 month earlier, and Lindsey Graham is now out on his own.
Yeah, and he's up for re-election in South Carolina, where he's had some trouble on the right, but not now. And the talk on Capitol Hill about whatever happened to Lindsey Graham is so prevalent that Lindsey Graham himself asks that question all the time in public. People ask, whatever happened to Lindsey Graham? Nothing happened to him, whatever, but something happened to him. And I think one of the main explanations is, he kind of lost his anchor. Yeah. John McCain was his anchor. Yeah. And so he's flying on his own now.
You had said just how important the list was to getting Trump elected. If you were advising one of the Democratic candidates, would you advise them to put out a list, both to rev up the base?
Yeah, this is actually becoming a big thing. I said at the time that, wow, the Democrats might have to do this now. This might become standard. And so I wrote a story about a month or so ago. So there's so many twists and turns in this stuff, right? But there's a new strategy by the Democrats they're trying to persuade all the democratically nominated federal judges who are still serving to stick around till 2021. And there's about 100 of them. So then they could leave then, and the Democrats might have a chance to replace them with more liberal judges and move that along. And they're identifying people who could perhaps be candidates for that. But they're not making those names public because they're advisory, and it's not the same as the candidate himself. But the conservative judicial groups are raising hell now, saying, well, you need to make your list public. We made our list public. So this is something you're going to hear a lot about. And then the Democrats fought back and said, well, you need to make your donors public because, all this is funded with dark money. Yeah. And so I think that you might see that, because usually, as I say in the book, when people talk about this and you're running for president, you'd say, oh, I'm going to appoint somebody in the mold of Scalia, or I'm going to appoint somebody in the mold of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You don't hear them say the mold of Clarence Thomas that much. No. But I think there'll be pressure. But the presidential campaign, Democratic primary, you're already hearing them talk a lot more about the Supreme Court because the base is up in arms. If there's another opening on the court, which Mitch McConnell said would only occur if there was a significant life-ending event. I thought that was an interesting way of phrasing something. I think there's only one significant life-ending event, and that's dying. But so everybody's really talking about this. I think you're going to hear more talk about the Supreme Court in this presidential election than we have before, and certainly more talk than we've heard from Democratic candidates. Republicans have focused in recent decades on the judges, the Democrats on the policy, and I think you're seeing that change now. But I think somebody probably will put out the list.
Okay, we got a question over here.
You've talked about with Merrick Garland, the money wasn't there. Can you talk more about what you mean by that? And
so they were going to they had a plan to raise like $36 million to fund a big national TV campaign, have this big staff to really work on Garland's behalf. There would have been a lot of advertising.
Just to also set the table, in 2016, the Republicans had a majority in the Senate, but they had an overwhelming amount of candidates who were running for re-election in states that Obama had won. So the initial fear is that Rob Portman in Ohio, Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire, Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania, they're not going to want to hold the line on this.
You're right. So they're going to go after these folks and try and break the logjam. So they start going around, raise money, and hit the usual suspects, and nobody's giving. Everybody wants to give directly to Senate races or to Hillary, because you want to get the bang for your buck, right? So what if you put all your money into the Supreme Court thing and you get nothing? Then you're really so there was no opportunity for this grand campaign. One of my favorite things, Harry Reid was terrorizing Chuck Grassley at this point. Reid just loved to get under Grassley's skin, and vice versa. He would go out on the floor every day, literally every day, and attack Chuck Grassley for blocking Merrick Garland. And Grassley was going nuts. And his staff wasn't used to this, It's like Grassley liked to see himself as this sort of bipartisan guy. And it was actually kind of fun to watch in a mean sort of way. But then they went out and they recruited a candidate against Grassley, and it was genius because the candidate was named Patsy Judge, who had won statewide in Iowa before. And so they go, well, this candidate is going to be great because every time we even say her name, it reminds people that Merrick Garland's being blocked, right? So they thought it was really great. She was 72, I think, which was actually too old to be running for the Senate for the first time. But since Grassley was like 84, it didn't really matter. She was actually 10 years younger than Grassley, I think, at the time. But you know what? She never really caught on. And Grassley kind of coasted. She's actually involved in politics. I saw she's either running for something or I think she's playing a big role in the caucus. She's a very well-known Democratic person in Iowa. I mean, I'm not making fun of her. But, it just didn't kind of click. It didn't click. And Ayotte probably ultimately was the one who got beat by this, right?
She lost very narrowly, and she also wavered on Trump. She couldn't decide where she was on Trump because she was for Trump. Then Access Hollywood came out. I think she pulled support toward the end. I think she was kind of like Paul Ryaning it.
Yeah.
To try and use a verb.
Trying, especially as a woman, she was really trying to do it. But the campaign, the money wasn't there. The campaign kind of never really took off, and they were down to basically, trying to have these press events and availabilities in the Senate. And if we cover one, once they keep going, they bring Garland up there, just diminishing interest in it. And, there was talk about, does he do interviews, which Kavanaugh, by the way, ended up doing. Remember the famous Fox interview? I was a virgin in high school. So should he do that? Should he go on the Today Show? Should they have a faux hearing, have Democrats convene a hearing to show how Garland would handle himself? And they just decided, Pat Leahy in particular, chairman of the Judiciary Committee or ranking member at that time, they didn't want to do a stunt. They didn't want to kind of diminish the importance of the office. I don't know whether that was good or bad. So they didn't do anything. And as Paul said, they didn't even mention his name at the convention because they didn't want to politicize it. And that's the White House today thinks that was probably a mistake, but I don't know what they could have done at that point. It was baked in, and the Republicans weren't going to move.
Yeah, I covered a lot of Senate races that in 2016. I traveled to Pennsylvania, Indiana, Nevada, Arizona, thinking of one trip, and every Republican candidate found a way to always mention the Supreme Court and to mention the vacancy. Some of it was like John McCain did it, like just kind of checking a box.
Yeah, but then he kind of screwed up at the end.
Yeah. He hinted almost that he would leave the if
they would never vote. They would never vote for a Democratic.
And the Democratic candidate never once, none of them. I never saw a Democratic candidate in any of those states talk about the Supreme Court. The only surrogate who talked about the Supreme Court was Bernie Sanders, and it was always about Citizens United.
So and it worked in the reverse too. I mean, some of you probably know Jerry Moran, the senator from Kansas. If there is a guy who's least likely to kind of rock the boat in the Senate, it would have to be Jerry Moran. I mean, this is the ultimate sort of go-along guy. And so he's out in Kansas at a town hall, and happens to mention, it's in this really little town in Kansas, and happens to mention that, you know what, he was elected to do his job, and we should probably consider Garland, right? And so it was so little town in Kansas, it took like 3 days for the news to filter back here. You know, it's like my carrier pigeon, you know, almost. It was so slow. And then everybody goes, what? Jerry Moran? And, you know, within hours, he was facing a primary threat, advertising starting against him. They just smashed him. And this was to discourage other people from kind of breaking. And everybody, you know, everybody saw what happened. No one was really going to do much after that. I mean, it's a real machine out there.
Yeah, we got a question back there, and we'll come, and then we'll come back over here. Or, okay, we'll start back here.
Could we switch the conversation a little bit to the actual confirmation hearings? And I
Yeah.
have 2 questions. One's a very particular fact question. There's a lot of talk around town that the senator from Maine,
Susan Collins.
Susan Collins called Kavanaugh and told him he needed to apologize to Klobuchar during the hearing, in part to make it easier for her to continue to support him. And then my more general question is, if you would reflect a little bit on the extent to which you think the Clarence Thomas playbook, the hearings from that playbook, really were just repeating themselves this many years later in Kavanaugh, in the sense that 2 things. One is there was a very circumscribed number of witnesses on the fact issues that came up around harassment and his groping of women when he's drunk and all that stuff in school, both high school and college, but also whether in some sense what Kavanaugh did was adopt Clarence Thomas's, except instead of being able to do the lynching, he just did it in whiteface and put the Senate on trial. And the Senate really just can't win that fight.
The Collins thing, I don't know. I'll tell you a couple of things about that. I don't know that she herself told Kavanaugh that he needed to apologize, but Kavanaugh was told he needed to apologize, I think, by multiple people. Susan Collins is a huge factor in this entire thing. She is the vote that counts here because, and so the entire hearing and everything that went on it with the FBI investigation, this was all intended to get a yes vote from Susan Collins because they had to have her. So Don McGahn was like glued to Susan Collins. They talked constantly. The thing that Susan Collins had said was that, you know, hey, if this is a high school thing, you know, maybe he should just admit he was drunk and, you know, and go at it that way. And Kavanaugh would not do that because he said, I didn't do it. I'm not going to say that. So, and of course, she was hugely influential in the outcome here. Interestingly, they got a little bit bigger majority now. They don't need her vote anymore on the next one. And so one of the reasons that Amy Coney Barrett, a very conservative Notre Dame law professor, who's a circuit court judge now, they didn't think they could get her past Susan Collins. So you might see her name come up. What do you think about the Clarence Thomas thing?
You know, Don McGahn is old enough that he was probably just about in law school, first or second year during. It would have been just getting out of law school, I think.
McGahn was really motivated by the Bork hearing.
Yeah, I mean, there's two hearings for Republicans and sort of their mindset and playbook. One is Bork, where he was rejected on a bipartisan vote, and the other is Thomas, where he narrowly wins confirmation. I hesitate to say that they were repeating that playbook because the Trump era, it feels like the entire playbook is different.
Yeah.
And that both Kavanaugh and Lindsey Graham were aping the Trump era more so than replaying the Thomas playbook. So I just, there are a lot of similarities to how things broke down, right down to the final vote. They both got it 51 or 50. They may have both received 52 votes. Exactly, but I think it's just harder to know.
The amazing thing to me about that parallel was that 27 or 28 years later, we could be in the exact same situation, and that no one still would know how to deal with it. There was no way to deal with this. And
The the Bork seat was Lewis Powell's seat, who in the 70s and first part of the 80s was the swing vote. When Bork gets defeated, they end up replacing Bork with Anthony Kennedy, who goes on to become the swing seat, who has a clerk named Brett Kavanaugh, who gets picked all these years after Bork fails as the seat. So,
Yeah, the Kavanaugh, the Kennedy thing, and just a little bit about that. I mean, there was a the big campaign by Don McGahn to make Kennedy feel comfortable leaving. Now there's some other allegations, about Deutsche Bank and stuff, but they just put Kennedy clerks everywhere. It's like, and Gorsuch is a Kennedy clerk. So there was this, maybe there was other stuff at work where there's a very subtle campaign to get Kennedy to feel okay about leaving. The interesting thing about Anita Hill is we're going to hear a lot about that as long as Joe Biden stays in the race, and certainly if he becomes a nominee. And the thing I have to keep reminding people about Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas is, they was like, oh, wow, the Democrats, they really got beat there. The Democrats were in charge. People forget that, and this is where Biden is, still having to answer to the fact that there was, in the Anita Hill case, there were more corroborating witnesses than they were in the Kavanaugh case. And that was her problem. There was no corroborating witnesses. There were people who said other events, but not certainly so direct. But, Biden is still having to explain why he didn't let those other women testify. And it's a very complicated scenario about whether they agreed to or not to. But there were witnesses, and they, at one point, were willing to testify.
Yeah. Okay. We have a question over here. Yes.
Yeah. I grew up in Iowa. No offense to the stories.
I love Iowa.
I actually spent a lot of time in Ottawa. It's a
Yeah.
beautiful place. Question I have from your study is, what's the impact in your view of having so many and having a number of non-lawyers on the judiciary committees, some of which didn't finish college? Of course, Iowa, we have Steve King on judiciary. Struggled with the first year, then went home.
Cool, and Grassley, the chairman.
Grassley, of course, and that was an issue in the election with Braley saying we can't have. I'm sorry, saying we can't have Joni Ernst win because we'd have a person who's not it didn't work for him.
Braley.
Yes.
Huge mistake, by the way.
Do you think it has any impact? And I'm just curious because you've done quite deep study.
I mean, I actually, you should answer this, but personally, you got to have some lawyers there, obviously. I don't think it's a bad thing to have sort of just the layman view on some of these issues. Oddly, Al Franken, who was on that committee as a non-lawyer, he was probably the best questioner during the Gorsuch hearing. I mean, so sometimes it can benefit you to just approach it as a layman. I don't know that I've ever seen any real downside. But listen, those guys are surrounded by lawyers on that committee. But what do you think?
So right now, Grassley is not a lawyer. Tom Tillis is not a lawyer, right? I'm trying to think of who else. Feinstein?
Yeah.
She's not a lawyer? Okay,
Yeah, no,
all right,
that's true.
there's three.
Who was that? Who said that? Good one.
Feinstein.
Ernst, is she on there? Yeah.
Oh yeah, they just she
Because they really had to
yeah.
find some women to put on the committee for the
Yeah.
Republicans, so they wouldn't have to bring in the lady lawyer again if they got into that situation.
Yes. So I think it's actually there are probably now a more critical mass of non-lawyers than we've really seen in recent years. So I think I think it's something we're going to have to watch and see over the next few years. All right, other questions? We got one back here, and then we'll come over here.
The Republicans have had kind of a conservative feeder system for the judiciary since 1982 in the Federalist Society. Do you think the Democrats have anything vaguely comparable, or should they?
Well, what I referred to earlier, where the Democrats are trying to do something like this with going out. They want to identify a bunch of judicial candidates for these vacancies that they hope won't happen until another Democrat gets in the White House. And so they are trying to do it, but they're also trying to be very careful to say, we're not the Federalist Society,
Yeah.
we're not going to groom these people and do all this. They're trying to do it kind of in their own democratic way. I do think that there is some movement in that direction, but not quite. What do they call? I wrote the story and I can't remember. They have a name for this, something on the bench or something.
I can't.
And so they're trying to a little more do it, but I'm just not. It won't be as organized as the Federalist
Yeah, I
Society.
mean, there are groups. Nan Aaron, who
Yeah.
Carl referenced, runs something called the Alliance for Justice. They've been working on these issues for a long time.
Since the
There's
80s.
a coalition of liberal groups, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, NAACP, now Planned Parenthood, that work on these issues. But with Will Rogers, Democrats organization, there's just a lot of them, and they all have their sort of different agendas. So it's not the sort of patriarchal Republican Party where there is one group that really just dominates
And
everything.
one thing the Democrats are trying to do that I think is different, and actually, I think to their credit, they're trying to identify different kinds of lawyers to be federal judicial nominees. Right now it's U.S. attorneys, like big corporate lawyers and friends of senators. They would like to see people like defense attorneys, public defenders, immigration lawyers, people with just a different kind of expertise to sort of change the makeup of the courts a little bit. And to me, that makes sense. Now, there was a public defender that from Iowa who is now a circuit court judge in St. Louis, a woman that the Democrats considered along with Garland because they were looking for ways to go. And, here's this woman from Iowa. Grassley had supported her.
Millett? Or?
No, I forget her
No.
name. Had support Jane, somebody or other. Sorry,
Oh,
we don't need to be
yeah.
thinking out loud.
by the book.
But
You'll
it's
find
like,
out.
but it was funny, but they immediately struggled with the public defender thing because what do you do if you're a public defender? You represent people charged with serious crimes.
Yeah.
And so you're just, they're going to beat you over the head with that. Why did you help that? Why did you help that sexual assaulter get loose to sexual assault again?
Yeah.
But so that's kind of one of the problems with changing the sort of background of these lawyers. But I think it's a noble effort, honestly.
Sure. Okay. Back here.
I just wanted to ask about the criteria that the senators used for actually judging these nominees if they actually come before the Senate.
It's flexible.
Yeah, I mean, because it seems it sort of devolved because you can either say if you're a nominee, I respect precedent, so that
Right,
kind
right,
of protects you there. Or you can say, I can't comment on anything that may be an issue that appears before the court. So it sort of takes away all of the content from the judgment process. So the only basis on which you can judge these nominees is sort of their character, which pushes you into, these ugly hearings. So first of all, is that a correct statement? And also, is that a change? I mean, did it used to be different?
I mean, so this is from the Bork hearing. Bork considered himself a super intellect, and he thought he could win a political argument and a philosophical argument with the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he found out that he couldn't. And everybody since then has said, I can't answer that because it's going to come up before the court. But I believe in respecting precedent, but also parentheses, but I can do whatever I want when I get on there. And so it's all on their record. And the background checks, but the background checks aren't really good. I'm constantly hearing stories about stuff missed in background checks. And it's hard. You guys, neighborhood here, you probably have all been approached by the FBI about checking out one of your neighbors or anything. When I usually say they're great, even no matter what's going on over there. But so this is why the paperwork is so important. And this is always that's what Miguel Estrada, they said, we need to see your paperwork from the Solicitor General's office. They didn't want to do that. The fight over Kavanaugh's documents was because they go, we want to see some of these documents. So it's just gotten to be kind of this big game, and how can you get your preferred person through? and everybody is perfecting all these techniques and how to go at it. But, you know, I keep giving talks about this book, and people leave very depressed. I wish I could. I wish I could be more optimistic. I've had Democrats say, you know, they read it and like who worked on this stuff and got PTSD from it.
Yeah. Carl writes about meetings that Democrats held in 2001, and Chuck Schumer, then a freshman senator, was the one who was really pushing to try to move beyond just looking at the character assassination type of stuff, to look at their ideology, with Cass Sunstein and Lawrence Tribe and some really elite law professors. And it has been a recurring thing. But it's so hard to get, like, these people. I mean, Brett Kavanaugh is swearing in Don McGahn in 2007, and Don McGahn says he's going to be a Supreme Court justice. They have been rehearsing since, you know,
He
first year law school.
He had 2 previous hearings, so he's really good at this.
And they just know what to say. And you could match up, if you just looked at Brett Kavanaugh's first hearing, not after the allegations, but you took his first hearing and Elena Kagan's first hearing, and you matched up their answers, I bet you couldn't tell at different points which one was which.
Yeah, it's you know, and so what Schumer was doing, and it was, Republicans don't like this, but what Schumer was saying, listen, we should talk about the ideology of these people and vote on that and just make it obvious, because we're really secretly voting on the ideology, but what we're doing is trying to find weird little things that they smoked pot or you know, didn't pay their taxes or a nanny, and we're trying to disqualify them on these little issues where we should be thinking bigger. So, but unfortunately, I don't see any big improvement coming in the judicial nomination process.
All right, more questions. Looking around. Okay,
Sure.
we have round 2. Go for it.
I was really intrigued by one sort of passing statement you made, and it was about Brett Kavanaugh being a political beast, right? And I thought maybe his invoking the Clintons really especially showed that off. So I wonder if you can talk about him, you know, working in the Bush administration, being a
or for
political
Ken
person.
Starr. I mean,
Right.
this is what drove the Democrats who'd been around for a while, namely Durbin, Leahy, and who else had been on that committee for
Durbin,
Kavanaugh?
Leahy, Feinstein.
Yeah,
Schumer,
I mean, they'd had
they
a
were all
lot
there.
of dealings with Brett Kavanaugh over the years. He was Starr's guy. He was accused of leaking grand jury testimony because he likes to deal with the press. He's Bush's front gate. You know, he's super political. And that Durbin famously called him the Zelig of all the Republican political hits over the years. Right?
No, that was actually in 2004 or 5. This
right.
is long before he actually became a judge.
And there's this thing. So here's an interesting thing about the Democrats and Brett Kavanaugh. There's this episode that I talk about in the book where the Democratic computers of the Judiciary Committee were sort of raided by a guy named Manny Miranda, who was working for Orrin Hatch at the time. It was basically, it wasn't a hack, really, because their computer security was so bad, he just kind of logged on and all the stuff was there. So they took all these documents. These were Leahy's documents and Durbin's documents, and they are still really pissed about this. And they think that Brett Kavanaugh was getting these documents on the other end. And some of the stuff that came up in the latest hearing showed that he was CC'd on some of those documents. And they really pressed him on this, because when Leahy started questioning him, people were like, boy, that's obscure. But listen, these were Leahy's computers. And he's mad. And so they think that Kavanaugh has been lying for years about knowing where these documents came from. So, but he has been a political operative. But you know what? The Republicans say, well, there a lot of other justices. Stephen Breyer was counsel on the Judiciary Committee. You know, that's a political operative too.
Abe Fortas was basically LBJ's money man.
Yeah, bag man.
Yeah. All right. On this topic, how close did the Trump White House, Trump himself, were they ever close to really thinking about pulling the Kavanaugh nomination?
Yeah, I think they were. You know, Don McGahn was the Kavanaugh guy. there was a lot of resistance to Kavanaugh, mainly because of this long track record he had. And there were people who were trying to sink his nomination. And in the book, I mentioned this one. And getting Trump. Trump wasn't that. Kavanaugh's a Bush guy. You know, he's associated with both Bushes. So and you know what, Trump doesn't like the Bushes. So there was this one story planted by these conservative judicial operatives in the Daily Caller, which Trump reads when they were trying to knock Kavanaugh out before even the nomination. And it was like, Kavanaugh seen as low energy Jeb pick, right?
Oh.
This is going, that was the headline. They're going right at it. It's like, and Trump reads the Daily Caller. So they're like, that'll get him. But McGahn really wanted him. Mitch McConnell wasn't that enthusiastic about him. You know, he thought there'd be other people that'd be easier to get. So all along, it was Don McGahn and Leonard Leo. And I have heard, I actually don't report this in the book because I didn't quite nail it down, that Leonard Leo at one point, so if he hears this tape, he can call me and complain and say that's not true. But he had said that I'd heard that he said, you know, we should probably pull this nomination. But McGahn wouldn't do it. And McGahn said all along, I know where the votes are. We're going to win this thing. So I don't think, but after the Blasey Ford, her testimony, which was very credible and she did very well, you know, there was a lot of hand wringing. It's like, oh, we're dead. And Trump calls McConnell and McConnell says, we're only at halftime. So.
Wow. Anything else? Or if not, we're going to do some book signing, but I want Carl to end by telling a story. It's 2005. The Republicans are furious with the Harry Reid blockade of judicial nominations. And we are talking to the now former senator of Virginia, John Warner, and he take off.
So people who have worked in the Senate here know that a lot of times we interview the senators out in the little hallway where the elevators are when they come off the floor, and we do a lot of interviews there. And John Warner, who I always call the senator from Central Casting, he just looked and sounded
The Virginia Squire.
Yeah, the Virginia Squire, and he was a really great source too. So thank you, John Warner, over the years. But so he gives this impassioned defense of the rights of the minority in the Senate and the Constitution.
He was reading the Federalist Papers.
Yeah, I mean,
he was
just
going deep.
Yeah, he was really, he gives us just this rousing speech about this deal they've just cut. And so he comes walking off the floor, and Paul is actually there with me, and and Kate Zernike, another Times reporter, and this is what we do, the Marble Halls. And so he comes out, and I go, wow, Senator, that was quite a speech. He goes to get on the elevator, because that was quite a speech. You should write a book about it. He goes, book. He goes, you remember he was famously married to Elizabeth Taylor for a while. He had like 4 marriages or something. So he said, book. It's like, if I write a book, all anyone wants to know is how Liz was in bed. And we just start laughing. And he's getting on the elevator. And I go, well, maybe that could be a chapter, Senator. And he goes, more than a chapter. And we laugh so hard, and we go, we're not. That's too good to report. We're not even doing that. But I threw it in the book because you gotta spice it up a little bit.
All right, everybody. On that note,
thank you, Paul. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Paul and I have done quite a few speaking things together. It's actually kind of funny. We're used to it.